be about a 30-minute presentation because we have our budget hearings with the council start at 4 o'clock. And at that point, I will turn the microphone over to our budget chair, Berkeley Allen. But for now, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Ginger Hauser, who is the Senior Advisor for Intergovernmental Affairs with the Office of Mayor John Cooper. Ms. Hauser, you are recognized. Okay, now try it. They're all listed as being on. All right, I tell you what. Can you hear me? Okay.
Wow. Can I bang the gavel? Okay, rock and roll. Thank you, Mr. Vice Mayor. Sorry for the technical difficulties. And Madam Budget Chair and members of the council, I appreciate you giving us time to give you just a high-level overview of this legislative session. As Vice Mayor introduced me, I'm Ginger Hauser, the Senior Advisor for Intergovernmental Affairs, but I've brought with me two individuals that have been crucial to working for the city during legislative session. Alex Dickerson, right in front of me, is with Metro Legal, and he is our assigned attorney, and he reviews all legislation and amendments and works with departments to gauge their analysis of proposed legislation so that we know which side of bills we're fighting for or fighting against or to amend. Do you need to get in here? Okay, I'll keep going while he's doing this because I also have Theo Morrison to my left, your right, and he is with Morrison Capital Strategies and works with me and you to represent the city, and he works with me to make sure that your state legislative questions are answered during session.
I think you're ready.
Okay, and I'm going to pop down to the other seat. There we go. Okay, so by way of background, this is the second year of a 2-year legislative session. And what that means is if a bill didn't pass this year and it didn't pass last year, then they have to start a whole new process over again. So we will begin working with new members of the legislature, new members of our delegation on legislative strategy for the next year. There were almost 1,500 bills filed in the past 2-year session, and 560 of those passed. And of those, we were really tracking and monitoring about 600. So the volume is pretty fast and furious, and it usually starts kind of like a funnel, and as session goes on, you start narrowing down what really you've got to examine and look at. We were very successful working with several partners in defeating legislation that was bad for Nashville, but also bad for local government. And those included preemption related to the regulation of food trucks, short-term rentals, billboards and their digitization, zoning, codes enforcement, eminent domain, also incentives that we give for diverse hiring and diverse contracting. Gun laws and policy would have been preempted from local governments in certain ways, COVID policy, and also we defeated a bill that would have mandated that charter schools automatically have the ability to purchase Metro and other school buildings at $1. And we were able to defeat that legislation too. I must note that we didn't do that on our own. We try to have collaboration on everything, and that really is the best strategy for the city of Nashville. We work very closely with the Tennessee Municipal League, the Tennessee County Services Association, the Nashville Chamber, Metro Schools, the Greater Nashville Hospitality Association, the Convention and Visitors Bureau, the Greater Nashville Regional Council, the TEA, Tennessee Association of Chiefs of Police, the Public Education Foundation, NOAA, and even some of you and members of the school board this session. And as is the case every year, we will continue to fight preemption bills that try to take away the authority of local government. We also defeated a couple pieces of legislation that were specifically would have affected Metro exclusively. And that one bill really put into practice in state law, which is it would have required us to bid out and contract out hospitality tourism services. We currently do that, but it's not in state statute. And we felt like it was not good policy to put in state law how we spend our money for services, that we really want that to be a local decision. We also worked to defeat a bill that would have potentially replaced some of our elected school board members with appointed school board members. And in both of those cases, we worked with some of our friends here in Nashville to really withdraw their legislation because it wasn't best for the city of Nashville and its citizens. We did have some wins, and I'm proud to say that we passed and supported several pieces of legislation that passed. The first one was specifically related to Nashville. There were 28 parts of the state statute that, because we grew in population in the census, put us in a different section of the statute that was really meant for the city of Memphis. So Alex worked diligently with all of the departments across Metro government to figure out which statutes we were okay with being sort of lumped in with with Memphis, and which ones we were not. We worked with Representative Freeman diligently, and he was able to successfully get us in the proper place of the statute regardless of our expansive growth. So I really appreciate that collaborative effort. We also, as you well know, were able to get additional local authority, first of all, for entertainment transportation vehicles, which the Licensing Commission is going through that process right now, right after the end of session. The other bill relates to entertainment venues that are 21 and up, and that we have the local authority to regulate smoking and vaping, which was not the case prior to this legislative session. We worked with the chiefs of police and our own police department to extend the confidentiality of some body cam footage that relates to minors, like in a child care center or in a school, and also individuals in private homes. That was currently set to expire. We worked with them to expand that. We feel like for privacy's sake, that's just good business for our citizens, and we were successful in that. We also worked with the health community and advocates and mental health advocates to expand access to what are called opioid antagonists. If you think about the naloxone, I'm probably saying that incorrectly, but that kind of medication that will stop overdose deaths. A piece of legislation passed that now allows nonprofits, individuals that may come in contact with known users, to have access to that kind of medication, which we hope in Nashville and across the state will save lives. We supported our soccer stadium to be able to sell alcohol, and it was perfect timing as we just got started with their first games here. And Council Member Evans is not here, but she was deeply interested in the last piece of legislation that was sponsored by members of our delegation that improved the safety around blasting and also increased the notification. She was involved in that and kept abreast of that legislation as it went throughout the process. So probably the most impactful bill that was part of the governor's package that passed relates to his new K12 funding formula. Those of you who have been around for a long time, probably Vice Mayor Schulman remembers this. Former Mayor Purcell was deeply engaged in the passing of the first funding formula for schools, the basic education plan called the BEP. This piece of legislation replaces that after 30 years. It is a student-based funding formula. It does not go into effect this fall. It goes into effect the following school year. Packaged with the new formula was the governor's commitment to add an additional $1 billion in funding for K-12 schools. The original piece of legislation, we were estimated to get an additional $12.6 million in state funding. I will note that was far less in new state funding than our other big city school systems across the state. Through changes that we supported and worked on, that increase went from $12.6 million to $22 million. So although we would like to have more of an increase, we still were able to almost double from where we started at the beginning of session. And that increase was achieved by the four elements that you see on the screen. First, the weight that is given to charter school students, they're given an additional funding bump in their per student kind of funding value, if you think about it. Initially, it was going to be partially funded by local government and partially by the state. That bump will now exclusively be funded by the state. They also were going to change the way fiscal capacity is calculated to just a solely University of Tennessee model. That was actually moved back to be what's called a TASER UT model. That actually helps the city of Nashville by staying with that current fiscal capacity model. There was also an expansion in the definition of students that would be eligible for additional literacy funding. We know that is a challenge in metro and in many urban areas. That helps the city. And then the last element that really your team, along with the Nashville Area Chamber and the Nashville Public Education Foundation and NOAA, all work to get what is called a cost differential factor added to the legislation. Because we have a high cost of living, we have to pay our teachers more. It costs more to get land and build buildings. We wanted that recognized in the new funding for the new TISA Act. It's not in the funding formula. What that means is we will be lobbying every year to get a grant allocation, basically, to account for the fact that it costs more to operate here than other places. Yes.
Question for you. I understand we didn't. The $22 million we're going to still be.
You can pick it up if you want. Microphone.
Yeah, I understand, Ginger. We really are. I just talked to Abigail Tyler. We're going to actually be short $22 million that we anticipated coming. Can you?
So here's the difference.
Line that up a little bit.
So this is the next school year. The shortfall currently is this fiscal year that starts July 1,
okay,
if that makes sense.
Okay.
And my understanding of the budget shortfall that you all are going to be discussing is the number that the State Department of Education gave to metro schools in February
Right.
was higher than what they gave to them in April as far as their funding. I think I am told that is largely related to the numbers of school students decreased. And for some reason, I wasn't involved in those discussions, but somehow that decrease wasn't fully anticipated. So they got less than what they thought they were going to get. So that's for next year's school funding budget that you all will be debating, this new act, because it doesn't go into effect until a year later, they're kind of apples and oranges, but yeah, it does make it really confusing.
So for the current budget ending June 30th, we will be short 22 million to support education, or you're talking
I
about
think
this
it's
next
the
year?
one that picks up
It's
July
23,
1.
24.
That's
Okay.
correct. And then this new funding formula goes into effect the following July 1.
Okay, so is there a position that Mayor Cooper has in terms of what to do with the 22 million shortfall?
I know that Council Lady Allen has been working
know
with
she
the
is working on it.
administration, and I'm sure you all on working on the budget are going to be looking at ways to come up with that shortfall.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. It is also relevant to say just hours ago, the state Supreme Court did sort of issue their ruling as it relates to the voucher suit. So as you all think ahead to this new student-based funding formula, we're going to have many conversations in the years ahead, whether it's in the court or in the legislature, about how the voucher statute that affects Nashville and Memphis is impacted by this student-based funding formula. So I think in the next few sessions, we'll have a lot of work to do on that front. And I think you'll see later today the mayor issuing a statement about that court ruling. So we'll move from education, if that's okay. There were several other bills that we were watching that, as we dig into doing deeper analysis, we will inform departments on the impact and their way of doing business. These are before you. The couple I wanted to just highlight, because it affects you directly as council members, is your ability, if you see fit, to do a 1% hotel motel tax related to the financing of the new Titan Stadium. That piece of legislation did pass, and that is something in your realm of authority. There were also some pieces of legislation that affect conflict of interest and public notice. The top two may be of relevance to you. There is an opportunity when you call a special called meeting now that you may not be able to meet sort of the day requirements for public notice. You have the ability now to post that on a website and at community locations at least 5 days before the meeting and still meet your requirements. That was put in state statute now. In addition, before this meeting got started, we were just talking about a process that is in effect right now related to conflict of interest, that if you have a conflict of interest and you can work with your counsel on that as it relates to maybe you or your spouse being employed by Metro. I'm sure you guys are not, but you might have a spouse that is. The need to declare that before you vote on the budget this year or any tax votes. Those directly impact you. There were other pieces of legislation that deal with our county boundaries and the fact that if the county boundary is to be changed, you have to do a 2/3 vote of approval in this body for that to take effect. I think that resulted from a small change in the Davidson County boundary. And now there's a state law that makes it more clear, the process to change that boundary. There also, we will be digging into some land use changes in state statute that took effect. Most probably heatedly discussed with this body and advocates in Nashville were the first bullet that criminalizes camping on local government property and state right-of-way. It basically expanded the criminalization on state property and expanded that to locally owned property and right-of-way. Right now, Metro, not right now this minute, but right now, departments within Metro are meeting to discuss how do we plan for that and going into effect July 1. The Homelessness Planning Council just last week discussed it at their meeting. They also asked for a task force to be set up for that they could be involved in that planning process so that we can be prepared for how we are going to handle that on July 1. Yes. Here? Yes, yes. Bullet 2 relates to a court case, and this puts in law the results of a Supreme Court case. So I have not read the case, so.
So we talked with planning staff about this one when it came up, and essentially what it does is it codifies an existing test that we already have to follow, the Nolan-Dolan test, so I think what it's called. But basically, the idea being that whenever you require an exaction, there has to be that essential nexus. And so in the whereas clauses to the state law, it makes it clear it's not intended to expand upon what the court rulings say. It's merely codifying it so it's clear that it applies to Tennessee planning commissions.
Yes, Councilman.
Councilmember Swope.
How would that specifically relate to,
You can pick it up if you want.
how would that specifically relate to the planning commission mandating sidewalks to private developers as they develop?
I mean, I'm not sure exactly how that would, we haven't looked specifically at that issue, but it has an effect for any exaction that they have. So it's going to be broadly applicable to whatever, it can't be disconnected. The exaction you're seeking from a developer can't be disconnected from what it is that you're seeking to remedy. That's all it says.
But it would affect sidewalks.
It should affect any exaction. There's some limitations within this bill that it has to be. I'm not sure if it's specific to individualized properties or broad connection. But there's a couple limitations in it. So I'd have to take a look at that bill to let you know specifically.
All right, thanks.
And it's probably worth saying, after this presentation at the end of the month, we'll be doing a little more detailed overview for departments. And then my plan is in June, working with Metro Legal and our lobby team, we'll be giving them basically a much more detailed handbook where we can get into, this is going to affect your regulation on X, Y, and Z, so that they know. What we're trying to do is make sure our departments are not caught off guard by a change in the law without understanding it, as can happen. So I think Alex will probably, specifically on your question, council member, will be looking at that and others so that he can direct the planning commission, appropriately on the state law. Fortunately, Alex is the attorney for the planning commission.
And like I said, we had some discussions, and Lisa Milligan, and they didn't have any concerns with what we were looking at in terms of how it would affect how we're doing.
And just to be enormously clear, I'm actually looking at this probably from the opposite side of what you're thinking. If there's a country road and a developer develops a piece of land, planning mandates that they put a sidewalk there that starts and ends in 200 feet, and there's nothing for miles on either side of it. By not putting that sidewalk in, they're forced to pay a payment in lieu of sidewalks. Seems to me that SB 2849 would eliminate that requirement.
And I think that's the kind of analysis that really Alex is going to have to dig into a little bit and really be able to advise the planning commission so that they rule the appropriate way on things like that. Sure. I will say, since we went back to this slide, that the third bullet, I believe, does relate to a situation in Nashville. I think it's with the Nashville Food Project in Metro Parks. And by adding the definition of vacant public land to public property that we're not using, I think it may resolve some conversations between parks and that nonprofit. I'm not in the middle of those, but this legislation was sponsored by Nashville state representatives related to an issue. So I don't have to tell you, it was a year of redistricting, and we had some small changes and then some big ones. So we have new congressional, state house, and state Senate maps. On the Senate side, one sort of major change for who we're going to work with is Senator Hale with Sumner County, who is in leadership, did represent a part of Davidson County. He was co-sponsor and sponsor of some of the legislation that I've just described to you. He will no longer represent Davidson County. We will pick up Mark Pody of Wilson County. We've already met with him. He's now included in the Davidson County delegation meetings, and we are making attempts to kind of build a bridge there, as he will represent part of Davidson County. A couple House districts, their boundaries switched in very large ways. One was District 55 that Representative John Ray Clemens represents, shifted enormously, but interestingly, he is in his new district running unopposed. And 59 changed dramatically, and it is an open seat. And part of why it's an open seat is that Senator Gilmore and Representatives Mike Stewart and Jason Potts are no longer going to be representing us. So we will have 3 new ones in our delegation. But the most significant part of redistricting is this map before you, which is the old 5th district is now the 5th, 6th, and the 7th. And we will see what happens. We have begun to have initial conversations with representatives in 6 and 7 so that we can begin to have a relationship with them as, for example, Congressman Rowe is going to represent, I believe, the airport. Potentially, Mark Green will represent the whole entertainment district, the state capitol, or Odessa Kelly. And so we're beginning to, in anticipation of these pretty dramatic changes, start having conversations. We're not having conversations on the District 5. It's an open seat. It's too early in the process at this point, but we're trying to build some relationship there so that hopefully they'll represent our interests. Yes.
Councilman.
Hey, this kind of relates to redistricting in that because, and I think some of the state House districts and maybe Senate districts relate to it. Like, because we went through redistricting and council districts were redrawn and school board districts were redrawn, like there was a mass change of like where people go and vote. Is that something that the election commission has, like, to what extent do they have free reign and to what extent are there like state laws that give them guidance? And I know we're kind of getting out of the legislative session here, but it does relate to redistricting. And I maybe we don't answer that now, but I'd like to.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know that those changes were a state decision. I'm unaware of any impact these maps had on that, but it could be something we can find out. Okay, we'll find that out for you.
Yeah, I mean, like, yeah, especially like how many, one of the key things is like, what are the limits on how many voters, registered voters, are assigned to a given polling place? And if there's flexibility around that's what I want to know.
Okay. All right, we'll find it.
And I would just say, hopefully there's communication between state election officials and Metro election officials. But we will stay on top of that.
You just keep the mic because you're now going to talk about the budget.
I can do it.
Then we'll wrap up.
All right. Can you hear me? All right. Thank you. I'm Theo Morrison with Morrison Capital Strategies, and I'm very honored to be part of the Metro Lobby team. I think we had a very successful year, all things considered. And I'm going to delve into the state budget. The governor's budget came out to $52.8 billion. And it actually includes some transportation projects, including the $40 million for the Cleveland Street extension in the I-24 underpass, $28 million for the I-40 interchange at McCrory Lane, an additional $2.5 million to plan an expansion of U.S. Highway 431 State Route 65 in Robertson and Davidson counties. Let's see. And then for residents, the state is funding a one-year waiver of the state portion of the vehicle registration from July 1, 2022 to June 30th, 2023. Thank you, Ginger. For Nashville, it was a great year for some of our higher education institutions. Nashville's Technical College will receive expansion money in the budget, and TSU will receive a one-time $250 million infrastructure improvement and $4.2 million for a new football operations building. The state is also making a large investment in high school and middle school career technical education, often referred to as CTE, and the amount of that funding is $100 million. In addition, the state is funding a pool of funds for teacher salary increases and support for summer programming and investments to increase access to IT classes for public school students across the state. And lastly, there is a special allocation to the Vanderbilt Medical Center in the amount of $355,000 to support their providing access to visual environment program. In the area of public safety, the state will invest $100 million into to provide for a law enforcement violent crime intervention program. Also, the budget increased the daily rate that the state pays to local governments to house locally sentenced felons from $39 per day to $41 per day. And then we have a few additional items to mention that are of interest to Nashville. That includes a 1-month state reprieve on the 4% state sales tax on groceries. Authorization for up to $500 million in state bonds and annual debt service payment toward a new domed Titan Stadium. Funds for restoration of the historic, iconic Elks Lodge on Jefferson Street, and funds for voting machines with a paper trail. And at this point, we will be happy to take some questions.
I don't need to get real deep into it. What did you say about VUMC and the grant they're getting for vision? What is that?
It's a special program they have related to, I think it's for those that are visually impaired, right? Mm-hmm. And
The PAVE program.
And we know that these aren't directly related to city government, but we thought because you represent in the city of Nashville, you'd want to know about these big investments that are being made. Yes.
I have a couple specific questions. Maybe I could just send to you.
Sure, absolutely.
Like the Charlotte 40 exit. It's been supposedly it was a priority, but I haven't heard that it's not there anymore. So I'll send you some notes. Thanks.
Yep.
I'd like to know about that.
Yep.
Yeah, it was a priority, and now all of a sudden it's gone. So thanks.
Okay, yeah, send that to me, and then we can, I'm in dialogue with the Department of Transportation about a few issues right now.
Just real quickly, thank y'all so much. I felt like we were really taken care of this year, and I'm just so grateful for the team and how hard y'all worked and how well you communicated with us specifically about what was going on. And I'm wondering if we can look towards some kind of gathering with the legislators, whoever they are, in the fall, just so we can start establishing those relationships if that's appropriate and kind of get an idea of what they're thinking about, or give them an idea of what's important to us.
I think that's a great idea.
Okay, great, thanks.
And we did kind of end session with, the mayor came to the Capitol and had lunch with the delegation as we were in those final days, and they were needing to vote on some things that were deeply impactful in Nashville, and had a real informal conversation with our delegation. And I think that was successful, and I think we'll continue to do opportunities like that. So.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Councilmember Swope, you asked a question before. I was communicating with our litigation director, and she said that one of the reasons we didn't think that the ordinance or the new state law will affect anything is because we actually won a court case on the sidewalk ordinance that justified it. And one of the things the plaintiffs claimed was that it didn't follow the Nolan-Dolan test. So we're essentially codifying that test, and we won a challenge based on that test. So I think we're comfortable that the sidewalk ordinance won't be affected.
Real-time answer. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I know you are anxious to start your budget hearings. Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thank you all for being here.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information on this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.